last time I was here, I started with a quick look at the newspapers, and we started a bit earlier and went through the newspapers and looked at all the eco stories that Sunday. This Sunday, I could only find one, which was about the pylons, the anti-pylon protesters in parts of England where there are going to be huge pylons coming through to allow the new clean energy and the upgrading of the decarbonised grid to take place. And here we are in the early days of the new Labour government. However cynical you are, you have to have some hope that the government is going to do something more than the last one did to clean up energy and to reduce the price of energy and deal with the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, the climate crisis, the possible military crisis, and I could keep going on, because each one of those is a reason in itself why you might want to consider living off-grid, and why we should all consider living off-grid, and why we should maybe consider not being so dependent on the grid as a country. And what I'd like to do in this talk is seek the advice of some of you as to how that would best be done. Because I do feel this is a crucial moment. The government last week announced their new housing target, 370,000 houses to be built a year. And they also announced their new energy plans. And they've started something called Great British Energy, which is going to have £9 billion to invest. And I noticed that they didn't really coordinate those two announcements. The housing announcement didn't really refer to energy, and the energy announcement didn't really refer to housing. But I do believe that the government sincerely wants to do something about the housing crisis. And of course, there are many things they could do. They could be taking all those empty houses and ensuring that people were living in them. They could be taking all those empty offices and turning them into housing. But whatever they do, they're going to have to build some new houses. And there's a 10-year waiting list for new housing estates to be connected to the grid in most parts of the country. There's also a 10-year waiting list for new solar farms and wind farms to be connected to the grid. And you'd have thought that the answer was right there, isn't it? Cut out the middleman, the grid, just connect the solar farm to the housing estate somehow, and there's your answer. And there are a whole load of stalled housing estates that could go, start building now. But I want to ask you here what you think I should be campaigning about over the next few months, because it's, as I said, a crucial few months. Only going to have one chance to get this right. The government's only got one chance to get this right. And rather than watch them fail, which is what I rather fear they're going to do on the current outlook, I'd love it if I could help them introduce much more small energy into their thinking. And I'd like to ask you, are there people here who are energy experts? Is there anybody here who's lived off-grid? A few. And you've presumably worked with small-scale energy right at your own sort of household level. You know how to put up a solar panel and how to size your battery so that it's going to not run out, and how to regulate your energy consumption so that you make your energy last the longest possible time. And how in the winter you've got to be much more careful, and it's harder with your solar panels. But if you've got wind, then you're going to have to worry less. And what kind of batteries should you buy? There's a new type of battery out now called the power station, which is like easy, handheld, very efficient, has sockets in it that you can plug straight into, and has taken a lot of the expertise out of setting up your own renewable energy. Has anybody set up renewable energy on anything larger than a household scale here? Nobody. And are there any people here who kind of campaign regularly, who are more than just interested but are consider themselves activists? Just a couple. In that case, I better ask, how many of you here were thinking about going off-grid? Quite a few. Right. Well, there's two ways of going off-grid, in the overview. One is on your own as a kind of preparation and adaptation for potential collapse and climate collapse. And for you, I recommend this book, How We Went Off-Grid, which I published but didn't write. And it's written by the two people on the cover who are stars of that TV series New Lives in the Wild, and Ben Fogle, the presenter, wrote the foreword. And what this gives you information to do is buy land in Wales for maybe 10 grand an acre, build a house for maybe 10 grand, and have planning permission, live legally in Wales. Only in Wales, although Devon and Cornwall are considering the same law. So it's called the One Planet policy. And the book is very valuable because if you're serious about wanting to go off-grid, then that is probably the easiest way to do this in Britain today. Because if you can get your planning permission, you're not going to have to worry, as so many people have had to do over the years, about how to finagle that process of turning a bit of land into residential, where you're walking around for years in fear of the neighbours and wondering how you're going to get their support and actually become part of the community, because that's your best route to being accepted in your off-grid situation. So those are just a few thoughts to begin with, and I'll now just kind of sum up where we are with the government. So you've got Ed Miliband and Angela Rayner in charge of energy and housing respectively. And there's a feeling that both of those politicians are setting themselves up to fail. Miliband has talked about large floating wind farms, and he's talked about new onshore wind farms. And he's talked about how they're going to try and change the planning law so that it'll be much harder for people to oppose them. But I'm afraid that that's going to take years. First of all, there's a consultation, then they bring in the planning laws. Then the planning laws get challenged in the House of Lords. Then they get challenged each time they try and put in a planning application. There's a wind farm called Hornsey 1, which is a huge 1.5 gigawatt wind farm that has taken 10 years to build since it got planning permission in 2014. It's that wind farm whose energy is going to be transported by the pylons which are now being resisted. And my first question to any of the activists here is, there's now a new group emerging of anti-pylon protesters who also see themselves as environmentalists. And I don't know if any of you saw the talk about hedgehogs yesterday. It was a very wise talk, and in it, the speaker was talking about how you might need to kill hedgehogs, and that you don't want to kill hedgehogs, but it might be better for the environment if you did, and that there was debates between the anti and the pro-culling lobbies, but they were both united in feeling that they loved nature. And in a way, the fairly wealthy anti-pylon protesters also feel they love nature. How do we harness that love of nature, which at the moment is opposed to our feelings about wanting clean energy, and turn that into a common ground where both of us are actually in support of small energy? Both of us want to see small-scale, locally owned renewable energy. I take it that's the general feeling in the room, as opposed to great big projects which just generate more bonuses for electricity company executives. How do we go about that process of persuading people, persuading government, persuading local authorities that it's the answer? Well, I've suggested one way, which is link it to local housing projects, local housing targets. Explain that one microgrid can power 1,000 homes for £7 million or something, quite significant. You can actually jump that queue, jump that 10-year waiting list that gets your new housing, its energy, and solve an immediate problem, and solve a problem about the grid, which is, by the way, that the grid is going to all the new energy from the grid over the next 10 years is already taken. It's needed for EVs. It's needed for data centers. It's needed for heat pumps in homes. So there actually isn't a solution that I'm aware of. Any thoughts from any of you about how do you pitch the government or the public on the idea of living with a microgrid instead of a conventional power? Yes, please.
I think it's a great idea. I think community power stations should be the future, rather than these big mega infrastructures. And I think, speaking to other activists, that's one of their drivers is to break down this nationalisation of everything, rather than going back to communities.
Yeah, and so the idea of community and localism is how you would sort of frame it.
I think to get where we need to be more independent on renewable powers, the infrastructure does have to change. Yeah, but looking at it as just trying to just do the whole infrastructure for the whole country, like you say, it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years before we even see any grassroots shoots from it. Whereas if you do it in communities, we can go to the communities that need it first, that we can implement it very, very quickly. We can then drive the housing industries into being more greener, because they've got a vested interest, like you've said, about their planning permissions being reduced and restrictions. And it just starts at that smaller level and then manifests out.
Yeah, there's an understanding and there's probably a demand. And so how do we take that understanding and demand and turn it into a reality? I think the answer is you find pilot projects, example projects where you think this could work, and then you push for it in that specific area. Is there anybody here who lives in an area where there is a bad electricity connection, where they sometimes get power cuts at the back?
So we're on top of a hill in the Forest of Dean, and the electricity can be, if there's storms or things, it can be on and off and things. But at the same time, it could potentially be a very good site for wind turbines and connecting people on that.
And how often or how rarely does your electricity go down? How many people live in that community?
So there are 72 houses in the village, and we get reasonably long power cuts of sort of a couple of hours, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, depending on the weather.
And do you have a battery in the house? Does that make a difference to how you live?
So we try to be as off-grid as we can, and electricity is the one stumbling block. So we've got solid fuel, central heating, we've got septic tanks, which was already there when we moved into the property. But it's managing to get your head around how you could set up other systems when you're already on the grid to support that or replace needing to be on the grid. And that seems more complicated than just building a house that's off-grid.
Yeah. It would actually be the perfect location for a small microgrid. By small, I mean 5 megawatts, which is kind of technical. I won't get into the technical terms, but 5 megawatts would be a big load of solar panels and a couple of wind turbines and quite a lot of batteries, and cost quite a lot of money. But it will cost a lot less than bringing the grid to a better energy delivery system to the village, a new substation, whatever. What I was hoping you'd tell us is what you do when the power is down, about electricity. Do you have batteries? Do you save a bit of energy for those times when the power is going to be down?
We just use other lamps or like battery powered lamps, or so we've got some solar powered lamps, and then the heating's still on. You can always put a kettle or a pan on top of one of the stoves.
Yeah.
So
So it doesn't interrupt your life
No.
very much at all.
no.
And the point I wanted to get to was that we're all completely accustomed to expect 24/7 energy, but we don't actually need it. The whole system is designed to deliver us, householders, 24/7 energy, but actually we could be fine with 20 hours a day of energy. And that would be an entirely different energy landscape and a completely different design for the energy system. And in India and in other parts of the world where there is frequent power cuts, people get by fine. So there's a problem that we've all been brought up to expect a certain kind of energy delivery system, which was designed and created long before we were aware of climate change and long before we were aware of the costs and the damage that some of our energy consumption practices are doing. Energy, as we probably all know by now, is about 75% of all carbon emissions are due to the production and consumption of energy. So energy is the number one key issue in solving climate change. And it's also a defining feature of our society. The centralization of the energy system mirrors the centralization of society. The fact that the grid is a few great big power stations connected by networks of lines that go out, radiate out, is very symptomatic of the problems in our society. Politicians are terrified of energy companies and terrified that if the energy goes down, they are the ones who get blamed and there's nothing they can do with it, about it. So they're constantly looking for ways to sort out the energy companies and make sure they're happy, whilst at the same time keeping a lid on prices. But at the moment, we've got this kind of patchwork, make-do system. On a global scale, a UBS bank has done research saying $160 trillion is needed to decarbonize all global grids. That's 160 trillion of our money that needs to be spent globally to keep the system the way it is at the moment. And all of us as environmentalists know that the system needs to change, but the problem has always been how. How do we change the system to make it more environmental, to make it less damaging to the climate? And my feeling is that by changing the energy system, we can change the economic system. By bringing power down to the communities, we can give people control of their own power. And the question is, how do we achieve that? How do we manage to make that happen? So first of all, I'll tell you a little bit more about what a microgrid is. I'm basing what I'm saying on averages. What is the average energy consumption of an average household? What is the average output of a wind turbine? This kind of thing. But from my research, I'd say that a £7.5 million microgrid could power about 1,000 houses successfully all through the year, and also have a load of surplus energy in the summer, let's say, if it's a solar farm, in the winter maybe if it's a wind farm, which then needs to be done, something needs to be done with it. It has to be distributed to somebody else who isn't a household, like a local farm or a local industry or some industry that's been set up specifically because that surplus energy is there. And what we're doing now, I think, is trying to come up with solutions that are not specific enough. As a movement, we need to actually focus in on our particular needs and our particular individual problems and try and solve them and use them as case studies for a wider reform. Right now, we're told by the government that you can't just set up a microgrid because you've got to be legally defined as an electricity provider to do that. But in the last few days of the Tory government, I got a letter from the energy minister saying, oh, actually, you can set up, it is legal under Ofgem regulations, to set up a 5 megawatt microgrid. And the reason is that they changed the regulations without really telling anybody. So I'm now trying to get that information to the government. But the government doesn't want to listen. They are focused on large-scale energy projects. And we know that the market is dominated by EDF and by the other big energy companies. And there was an interesting article in The Guardian a few weeks ago about the chairman of EDF. The new chairman of EDF used to be the civil servant who negotiated the deal with EDF to build a great big power plant. It's the Hinkley nuclear power plant. It's 14 years late. It's 17 billion over budget, and it's a great case study for what is going to happen, what could easily happen and go wrong with the Great British Energy financing that's about to happen. As I understand it, this 8 billion that Great British Energy has announced is going to be used to co-invest with energy companies in large-scale projects. So floating wind farms is the only detail that I've heard from Ed Miliband. Large floating wind farms in the North Sea that will bring the energy via pylons into the system in about 5 years. But what do we do now? What do we do when the next time Russia turns off the gas? What do we do about the new houses that are waiting to be built? What do we do about the huge increase in demand we're expecting from electric vehicles, where, by the way, something like 16 billion a year the government collects in petrol tax is going to go down every time a new person gets an electric vehicle. So they're going to have to start taxing electricity more because they're going to be losing the money from petrol. Or what are they going to do? So, creating your own energy might also be a way to avoid that extra tax on electricity that I'm very much expecting will have to be imposed to pay for green policies and to replace the petrol tax that there'll be less of. So microgrids. At the moment, most of us are paying 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 quid a year. Each one of us is paying that in their own home for their electricity. That is money that we could be paying into our local community energy fund. Each one of us has that financial power to switch that 1,500, 2,000 quid into a different payment, into a different system. If you've got a community of 72, that's £100,000 a year, 72 houses, that you've got to spend on an alternative energy supply. If the government, via Great British Energy, was to pump prime that by putting in an investment that would allow that microgrid to be built, you would have a solution. So maybe it is from those small communities that this push should come, this appeal to the government to not focus that entire 8 billion onto large projects. Maybe we should be aiming that, let's say, a quarter of it, 2 billion, could be spent on, maybe that would be 250, 300 microgrids around the country. That would be quite difficult to implement, but we know that those projects already exist because we know that all over the country there's hundreds and hundreds of grant applications and paid for feasibility studies that have already been carried out using government money. We know that there's thousands of communities that could benefit from off-grid microgrids, but it needs those communities to come forward and say, yeah, we'd like one of those microgrids. We know that it would give us like management problems to do with when exactly we can turn our washing machine on, but we're happy to live with it because we get the extra houses we need in our community. It needs those communities to come forward and ask for the money. So if any of you are in a community where you would like to see an off-grid microgrid, please get in touch or go to the off-grid website. There's a map there where you can actually meet other people who want to start a local community energy company. You can put yourself on the map. Once enough of those people have identified themselves, then we can put you together and help you lobby and get into dialogue with your local council, probably. But of course, for a lot of people, they don't want to run an energy company. It's the last thing they need in their lives. So the problem arises: well, how do we create this structure in a community? And again, I think it has to come either from some campaigners or from the government. There has to be some sort of local template that can be rolled out nationally, where everybody understands the system, where they understand that they as local investors can put their money in safely and that it will only be spent on electricity, and where they know when they're going to get their wind farm or their microgrid, and they know how it's going to be run. And that's the lobbying that I'm doing at the moment with the new head of Great British Energy and with somebody called the head of mission control for energy, a guy called Chris Stark, who was running the government's climate advisory committee. And if anybody wants to get involved in that and help in lobbying MPs, contacting energy companies, and trying to make this a reality, then please do get in touch afterwards. And also, of course, I have copies of that book for sale. So 2 different ways to go off-grid. One, on your own or in a tiny community, dealing with the planning laws. In Wales, that's much more achievable than in the rest of England. And what the book does is give you the framework, the cut and paste blueprint, where you just put in your details of what it is that you want to do in your off-grid life. And then you've got the package that you can present to the local authority. The other, much harder, much more long-winded, create a microgrid in your community, create a patchwork of users, the local homes, as well as the businesses that might be able to soak up the surplus when there is one. And now over to you for any questions about anything to do with off-grid, living, energy. Behind you.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm Alex.
windy, though.
I'm from Taunton in Somerset, and we're currently working on trying to launch, well, I guess it is kind of a microgrid, except it's not an electricity grid. We have actually a perfectly effective system of distributing and aggregating energy in the form of electricity in Taunton, no complaints about that. But there's no system for distributing heat. So what we're trying to create is a heat network where we can access some geothermal heat using ground source heat pumps and distribute that around the tightly packed little houses in the centre of Taunton. And it's all centred around a new development that our Community Land Trust is working on of 8 affordable flats. So, I think heat networks are an interesting way of looking at microgrids. There is some funding out there for it. We've managed to secure feasibility funding from the Community Energy Fund, and there is a more large-scale heat networks fund that the government runs. It is, however, extremely tricky because if you're doing an ordinary community energy project, you can plug into the grid and sell your electricity to someone on the other side of the country. If you're doing a heat network, your customers all live within a few hundred metres of your base camp, and they have got to buy your product, otherwise it's just not going to work. So we're going to be doing a lot of door knocking, I would imagine, and talking to people face to face and recruiting them individually to the scheme. I think heat networks have terrific potential. I am a little concerned about turning our backs on large-scale wind in particular, because wind generation does require, for best efficiency, to get the most out of the resources you put into it, you want very large turbines. The efficiency of the turbine increases disproportionately with its size, so you are in danger of chucking resources away if you do lots and lots of little ones. But yeah, heat networks, I commend to you.
Thank you. I'd love to hear more about the heat network. I think it'd be useful for everybody to know how the problem is that you get a grant for a feasibility study and then you somehow don't actually ever get the rest of the money that you need to actually do it. There's thousands of feasibility studies have taken place around the country that have led to no further energy production. But in your case, are you going to be generating any electricity, or are you just going to use grid electricity to power the ground source heat pumps?
Oh, it's absolutely part of the plan to have photovoltaic solar panels on the roofs of the new flats that we're building. But those will be grid connected because, of course, we can't just run the heat network when the sun's shining, and we do need to be able to aggregate it with other power sources from completely different parts of the country.
Absolutely, and there's no reason at all. There's not a virtue. There's no virtue in trying to be completely off grid. If you've got the grid, then of course you should use it and try and minimise your use of it because your alternative is quite possibly cheaper. You mentioned efficiency, and the large wind turbines are, as I understand it, 55% efficient. So 55% of the energy that comes through them gets converted into electricity. Solar panels are about 25% efficient. They're the least efficient of our clean energy sources. That is creeping up. So the latest solar panels, far too expensive for kind of consumer use, are about 30% efficient. And it's been going up steadily. As the price of solar panels has been going down, their efficiency has been going up. Small wind turbines are about 45% efficient, and hydro is about 75% efficient. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go to Wales, I'm going to get that book, I'm going to find some land with a stream or a river or a waterfall, and you've got your energy sorted. If you're a council housing planner thinking about housing, put your housing where you've got your energy resource. If you want ground source heat, make sure that you're not building your houses on a rocky foundation where you won't be able to dig down. If you are a community of people who are thinking about all buying houses, land together in Wales, even more so, find that waterfall and pool your money and, unfortunately get planning permission for that energy production using the waterfall. But think about how that you could create a community together with energy at its centre. And by the way, I've got a slight prejudice against communes because I see they don't work. So create a community means create separate houses where you pool your resources when it comes to energy and possibly the track, the road. But if you commit to kind of living communally, the problem seems to be it's very hard to get change, to get consensus. You spend much too much time working on the consensus and not enough time actually building something. And this has been a problem that's dogged all sorts of communities, and maybe there are people in the room who've got personal experience of it. But getting back to your point, could you please tell us a bit more about how this community energy is going to work in practice and how many homes it's going to help, and what problems you've been having getting the locals to join in?
Wow. I think I have to begin by saying we're at the very early stages of this. So the main problem with the locals is none of them have heard about it yet. There is indeed a feasibility study that we're beginning with, and the very first stage of the feasibility study is, as you say, the thermogeological assessment. We have to find out what kind of geological resources we have under us and whether that's going to enable us to effectively harvest heat. And I have to say, that could knock the whole project on the head straight away. When we get the results of that back, if they say it is simply not a good location to drill down for heat, then yeah, we've got a problem. If the feasibility study does come back with reasonably positive findings, then I think the next phase of raising the money to actually implement the scheme might actually be easier. Because we've got considerable experience now with the use of community shares, and when you establish a good underground heat collection system, it's actually got a very long lifespan. It can stay undisturbed for a very long time. So you have to pay off the cost of the scheme over an immense period of time, longer even than a conventional mortgage, and that should make it relatively affordable on a day-to-day basis. So I'm quietly confident that if the feasibility study does the goods, and we've got enough people locally to get that critical mass of initial subscribers, then yeah, raising the money to actually implement the scheme, that should be the easy bit.
And have you got any idea how many subscribers that is?
With a bit of luck, we can adjust the size of the heat collection system to suit the number of people. But I think really, to make this a proper heat network, we would be looking for something of the order of 100 households.
Only 100?
100 would be ideal because the current funding scheme has a particular opportunity for rural heat networks in settings where very large ones just wouldn't be effective. And there is extra funding you can access at 100, so that's kind of why I'm setting that as the threshold. But I think, we could make it work with smaller things, just with a more modest heat generation system. And I wouldn't rule out really going for it if we have a high take-up.
And in Taunton, people are pretty aware. It's not Totnes, but it's there's a reasonably switched on population. How hard is it going to be to find those people?
Like I say, I think because we don't get to pick and choose, it's we may very well have some very switched on people in, Galmington or Halcon, but unfortunately that's about 300 metres further away from where we're planning this thing than is convenient. So it's very much about what we find out about the people who are our next door neighbours, and we are just going to have to go door to door and talk to them individually, and I have no idea what we're going to find.
Well, please consider using the off-grid map as a place where you could ask people, it's a resource for you to...
Thank you, yes indeed.
To, put yourselves on that map.
Peth gyntaf i ddeud yw, nid yw Cymru llan o Lloegr. Oedd yn bwysig iawn, os ydych chi am symud i Gymru, bod chi'n sylweddoli bod yn gwlad hollol gwahanol gyda cymuned pwysig iawn. So I'm just telling you that obviously Wales isn't part of England. And if you do move there, it's very important you recognise a different culture and a different country. And that's the only way you're going to be able to integrate. Just wanted to say that. But I also wanted to ask a direct question, which is, what is your take on Ecotricity and that company and Dale Vince, is it, that set that up? How does that fit into what you're doing? Thanks.
Well, thank you for that reminder. It's a very important reminder that just turning up from England and buying a bit of land doesn't solve your problem. You have got a very long-suffering community in Wales who've seen far too many of their homes being appropriated by people who leave them empty a lot of the year. The book that I keep referring to is written by two Londoners who left London and went to live in Wales, and they made some mistakes, and I think one of their biggest mistakes was not getting their local community on board in the right way at the right time, which is to say right from the beginning and before they even started building their home. But they battled through and they got their planning permission in the end, and they got it through the local support, from enough people supporting them. And they found that most of the opponents, I'm sorry to tell you, were rich lawyers from London, And
It's not just a long-suffering community, though. It's a very beautiful community and worth knowing.
yeah, of course. But it's very odd how a lot of the opposition to off-grid activity anywhere in the country, anybody who buys a bit of land anywhere, seems to get most trouble from other incomers. It's human nature, I guess. But sorry, what was your other question? Ecotricity. Well, Dale Vince is a complex character, and you know, a sort of green Richard Branson, but you can't really be a green Richard Branson and still be green. So he's given £5 million to the Labour Party. He's very much listened to in those circles. I imagine he'll be Sir Dale Vince before too long. And it's hard to tell from, you know, as an outside observer, I don't know him. He doesn't seem to be championing the small-scale energy that got him where he is today. He started, as is now well known, in a field near Stroud, I think, with a wind turbine next to his caravan, and the wealthy locals, the rich people who live near him, tried to oppose his wind turbine, which was quite small. So he took them on and he got his planning permission, and he thought, well, if I've got a small wind turbine, I might as well make it a big wind turbine. And that is literally how he started. So all power to him, but he doesn't seem to be advocating small-scale wind anymore. He seems to be advocating large-scale centralized electricity. And if he is, and I may be wrong about that, then I would oppose him. But he does have the ear of Ed Miliband, you know, the energy minister. So he might be a route, you know, for us to get our voice heard. In the middle? Yeah, next question.
I just also want to point out that Wales is the first country to introduce the Future Generations Act 2015. So all credit to them, which is a model for New Zealand and other places. I'm thinking about Avonmouth, and they have set up their own community energy system. I don't know much about it recently. I don't know if you knew anything about that. But I'm very interested in cities, because that's where I live, in Bristol. And I live in Victorian terrace workers' house, of which there are numerous. And apart from solar panels and having my own battery system, it's hard to understand how a microsystem could be set under those things. Maybe it's just impossible. But Avonmouth, they have, I don't know what the latest is, but, if you knew something about it, but they did set up a community energy company, and as far as I know, they have applied for a wind turbine. And again, they had share system. So I'm wondering, in the suburbs or in places where there's more room, whether that might be a city model. I just wondered what your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, it's a city model. No question about it. And sorry, just one other point about Wales, which is that, of course, this book is aimed very much at people who live in Swansea and Cardiff and Newport, places in Wales, and might give them the opportunity to get themselves a beautiful rural, clean energy life as well. It wouldn't just be for the English people in the audience. The answer is yes, absolutely. These ideas can work in an urban setting. And for example, in West London, the Financial Times has carried stories that housing starts in West London have been delayed by the grid for 10 years.
Wow.
So it's happening everywhere. And
So what's the problem with that?
the problem with that,
Why there's a delay?
why is there a delay? Because the grid does not have the capacity in that part of the country, hasn't planned it in, hasn't prioritised it, because they're spending their money somewhere else for now. Or because I don't know enough about the architecture of the grid to be more specific. But it means that we have got these problems everywhere, and that a microgrid can just as easily be put in a city. When I say just as easily, there is a problem of land for solar panels. You're more reliant on rooftops. It would depend on each individual location as to exactly how you would do it.
So I live in a fairly short terraced Victorian house. They're all the same. We have a north side, we have a south side. And I have this vision of a company coming along and basically with some scaffolding on wheels coming along, literally going from each rooftop to the engineer inside, and then a done deal for the whole street, a special discount. Everybody has it done, it's done. And then you could have some kind of sharing of energy if you've got more. I'm a single person, there are people with families, if there could be a way that energy could be shared from household to household. And it feels like a standard thing that could be rolled out in each street quite easily.
Absolutely, especially on council-owned housing estates. It's harder where everybody owns the freehold because you just need one person to say no, and it kind of messes with the system.
But if I say that in my street we had six green placards for the election, that might give you an idea.
Yeah, and let's start with the places where it is going to work. Let's not look for the problems. Let's actually ask communities to come forward and say, we want in our area, we have consulted with ourselves, and here we are, we're ready. I think you've given me a good idea there, which is to ask people to announce when they feel ready. And
I come down from the... Sorry, just one more thing. I drive down, or I cycle down, I walk down, and I look over the whole city of Bristol, and there's all these terraced houses, literally thousands of them, all with their roofs with nothing on them. And I'm thinking, what the hell are we doing? It's like, that is solar energy waiting to be harvested. It just needs some kind of rollout system, it feels to me.
although not enough solar energy to actually power us all. You know, the panels on those roofs wouldn't be enough, and so there'd have to be something else as well. Whether it was a couple of wind turbines, and yet wind turbines, as the gentleman pointed out earlier, are lower efficiency than the big turbines, but they're still double the efficiency of solar panels. So the combination works well, but you've still got to get those accepted by the community. It won't be everywhere. So let's start with the places that want it and which are geographically, topographically suitable, and that's where I'm going to focus. Thank you very much for pointing that out.
Hi, you've got my brain reeling with lots of different thoughts and ideas, so I'll try and focus my thoughts for you. But I think, from in our situation, we've got a house that we have an EV, and EVs aren't the solution to everything. But one of the things we have set up, we took part in a trial which is vehicle to home powering, and we have our own solar array that we can charge our car using the solar excess energy we're not using, and then power the house through peak times or times when and then export that to. I'm really interested in that aspect of the decentralization of our energy grid, because there are the people in this room who are interested in off grid, and then there are, for each one of us, an awful lot of people who we need to bring along for the journey. The technology is not quite there yet, and technology is not going to save us from these problems. But we need to think, I think probably my thoughts boil down to two things. We need more joined up thinking. We need to bring people along for the ride to make this work. So my thoughts when you were talking about heat and talking about getting local residents on board, what about local businesses? How does that tie into local businesses? Because if you're a city centre and you can save businesses who are struggling and going under at the moment, my own business is struggling, how can you help them save money and stuff? Well, that's brilliant. So, and just to your point, we're in North Somerset and there's Low Carbon Gordana. There's another community energy group who are trying to set Bristol Energy and in Bristol, who I believe are here somewhere were earlier. But we in our school, we're trying to help the school to save money by using their flat roof to put solar energy on. So we're working with the community to try and get that to happen. So we're working in sort of more localized energy networks where we can. But yeah, if we can demonstrate to others how, like for example, I've been trying to keep an eye on how our own energy is and the changes we've made to our household is saving us money. Last year, our total electricity bill for the year was just over £900. But we're saving some of that but that includes our EV transport. So that's solar energy and the fact that we're using battery storage. That it's not domestic battery storage. It's a solution that we already have on our driveway that is for 90% plus of the time is sat stationary on our driveway. So we might be interested in off-grid. So I'm slightly trying not to derail the conversation from off-grid because I'm quite interested in how we can be as off-grid as possible. But for others who we're moving towards a situation where we're having more EVs, and we're kind of being forced in that direction. But can that be part of the solution? Demonstrate to others who aren't so interested in this stuff to go, actually, you can save money on your household bills, and it's kind of green by subterfuge, right? These systems will help you save money and help you to be more self-reliant. And once we get people thinking in that kind of way, we can sort of, it's a step change towards other changes that we might need to see, especially as we might get more volatile. And like you were saying earlier about
politically volatility.
Yeah, and we may end up we'll see power cuts happening, and I think of places like Addis Ababa where they've got their clock system where they go around a quarter of the city at any one time, doesn't have energy at certain times because they don't have enough power to power the whole city. So they're a society that are used to having energy cuts all the time, and they manage like others. And if we, well, I would guess not if, but when we get to a situation where we're going to have situations where we can't power our households, if we've made a step change towards, okay, well, we can help you to be more self-reliant and people start to see the benefits of this kind of thinking, then we can bring the wider society along with us.
Absolutely. Having kind of versatile, what's called resilient energy supply includes having lots of kind of different options and small pockets of energy here and there. The EV, of course, there's a big debate about cars in general, but that's a great example of the sort of versatility that you're going to need, where you could actually take your car from your home, get it powered up and bring it back to be the battery for your home, or conversely, you could be generating energy at home, which your car then contributes to the grid somewhere else. There are all sorts of possibilities once you start thinking creatively. But, the last time that this country was faced with a problem of energy, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak did a deal with President Biden, and a whole load of fracked gas was brought over in ships, which was kind of the worst possible solution. All the people who had opposed fracking were now using this fracked gas, which had come from America, instead of us fracking it ourselves. Not that I'm saying we should. But what could have happened would have been a different solution, like you said, of temporary power cuts, and the government would go to any length to avoid that. Any government would, because of the perceptions. They'd see it as politically unacceptable to behave like that. But again, the behaviour of off-grid people can give all sorts of information and hints to wider society about how we operate when we're off-grid, how we have our spare battery, how we save and husband our energy, in certain ways, and shift our consumption patterns. You're looking as though I'm finished.
I don't think we've got time for any more questions. Okay. So if everyone could give a very big hand to...
I'll be outside with this book after it.